Maxwell Rothschild stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the golden sunset paint shadows across Manhattan's skyline. His reflection stared back at him. Immaculate suit, perfectly styled silver hair, and eyes that had grown cold from years of ruthless decision-making. At 52, he was at the peak of his career, having built Goldcrest Enterprises into a real estate empire worth billions. Yet something felt hollow in his chest, an emptiness that no amount of success could fill. The leather chair creaked as he settled behind his desk, reaching for the small envelope that had arrived earlier that morning. It was different from the usual correspondence. No corporate letterhead, no formal markings, just his name written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, yellowed with age, showing a young woman holding two small boys. Maxwell's hands trembled as he recognized his mother's face. He hadn't seen this photograph in over 40 years. Not since the night everything changed. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Screaming sirens, the acrid smell of smoke, his mother pushing him toward the window, telling him to run. He had survived the fire that destroyed their tenement building, but his mother and baby brother hadn't made it out, or so he'd always believed. The intercom buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. "Mr. Rothschild, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. A Mr. James Connor from Metropolitan General Hospital." Maxwell frowned. He hadn't scheduled any meetings for the evening, and he made it a policy never to take unexpected visitors. But something about the name tugged at his memory. "Send him in," he heard himself say, before he could think better of it. The man who entered wasn't what Maxwell expected. James Connor wore scrubs under a worn jacket, his face weathered but kind, hands calloused from years of hard work. He carried himself with quiet dignity, despite his humble appearance. "Mr. Rothschild," James began, his voice steady but gentle, "I'm sorry to interrupt your evening, but I needed to speak with you about something important." He paused, studying Maxwell's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I believe you received a photograph today." Maxwell's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk. "How do you know about that?" "Because I sent it," James replied simply, "and because I was there the night of the fire. I was the other boy in that picture." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Maxwell stared at the photograph again, at the two small boys, one clearly himself, and the other. "That's impossible," he whispered. "My brother died in that fire. Everyone did." James shook his head slowly, pulling out a folded document from his jacket pocket. "No, Max. Mom got me out through the back stairs, but we got separated in the chaos. I ended up in foster care, bouncing between homes while you were adopted by the Rothschilds. I've spent years trying to find you." Maxwell's throat constricted. The document James handed him was a DNA test result, dated just 2 weeks ago. His eyes scanned the numbers, the scientific confirmation of what his heart already knew to be true. His brother, the baby he'd mourned for 4 decades, was alive and standing right in front of him. "Why now?" Maxwell managed to ask, his voice hardly more than a whisper. "After all these years?" James's expression darkened. "Because I need your help, Max. Not for me, but for the hospital where I work. Metropolitan General is being forced to close its doors. The company that bought the property plans to demolish it and build luxury condos." He paused, his eyes meeting Maxwell's. "The company is Goldcrest Enterprises." The revelation hit Maxwell like a punch to the gut. He had signed that deal himself just last week, another profitable venture in a career built on replacing old buildings with gleaming new developments. He had never once considered the human cost of his decisions, the lives affected by his pursuit of profit. "That hospital serves thousands of people in the community," James continued, his voice tight with emotion. "People who can't afford private health care, families like ours used to be, before the fire. Before you became Maxwell Rothschild." The words stung with truth. Maxwell stood abruptly, turning back to the window to hide the turmoil on his face. The city lights blurred before him as memories flooded back. His mother working double shifts as a nurse to support them, the community that had looked out for each other in their old neighborhood, the basic human decency he'd forgotten in his climb to the top. "I never knew," he said finally, his voice rough. "All these years, I thought I was alone." "You weren't alone," James replied quietly. "And you're not alone now. But I need to know if my brother is still in there somewhere, beneath all this." He gestured at the opulent office. "Because the Maxwell I remember would have fought to save that hospital, not destroy it." As the sun disappeared behind the skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the city, Maxwell Rothschild faced the most important decision of his life. In one moment, he had gained a brother and lost his certainty about everything he'd built his life upon. The contract to demolish Metropolitan General sat in his desk drawer, not yet executed, but now it represented more than just another business deal. It was a test of who he really was and who he wanted to be. James turned to leave, pausing at the door. "I'll be at the hospital tomorrow morning, doing my rounds like always. Whatever you decide, at least come see what you're planning to destroy. See the people whose lives hang in the balance." He left the photograph on Maxwell's desk, a reminder of a past that refused to stay buried. As the door closed behind James, Maxwell sank back into his chair, the weight of 40 years of choices pressing down on him. The photograph seemed to stare back at him accusingly, his mother's face both blessing and judgment. For the first time in decades, Maxwell Rothschild felt the foundations of his carefully constructed world begin to crack. The next morning, Maxwell's driver pulled up to Metropolitan General Hospital at precisely 7 a.m. He had barely slept, haunted by memories and the weight of James's words. The hospital's facade was weathered but dignified, its red brick walls telling stories of countless lives saved within. As he stepped out of his Mercedes, a young mother hurried past with a coughing child in her arms. The woman's worn shoes and tired eyes reminded him of his own mother, of nights when she'd come home exhausted from double shifts, still managing to smile as she tucked him into bed. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over crowded waiting rooms. Every chair was filled, and Maxwell noticed details his business assessments had never captured. An elderly man comforting his worried wife, teenagers helping their grandmother with paperwork, nurses moving efficiently between patients despite their obvious exhaustion. "Mr. Rothschild," James's voice came from behind him. His brother, the word still felt foreign in his mind, was checking charts at the nurse's station. "I wasn't sure you'd come. I needed to see it for myself," Maxwell replied, trying to maintain his usual composure despite the emotion threatening to break through. James nodded, his expression unreadable. "Follow me. I'll show you what you're really buying." They walked through corridors where every room told a story. In one, a young father sat beside his sleeping daughter, her arm in a cast. In another, an elderly patient was surrounded by handmade cards from grandchildren. James greeted each person by name, knowing their stories, their struggles, their hopes. "Mrs. Rodriguez," James said softly, stopping at a room near the end of the hall. "How are you feeling today?" The woman in the bed couldn't have been more than 40, but illness had aged her prematurely. Still, she smiled warmly at James. "Better, Dr. Connor. The new treatment is working. This is my colleague, Mr. Rothschild," James introduced carefully. "He's here to learn about our hospital." Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes lit up. "Oh, are you here to help save it? Help? We've all been so worried since we heard about the closure. This place, these doctors, they're family to us, Dr. Connor especially. He helped us when no one else would." Maxwell felt his throat tighten. "How so?" "My insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatment I needed," she explained. "Other hospitals turned us away. But Dr. Connor, he fought for me, found a way to get me into a clinical trial. My children still have their mother because of him." As they left the room, Maxwell noticed James wiping his eyes quickly. "You did more than just find her a trial, didn't you?" he asked quietly. James hesitated. "I've been paying for some of her medications myself. It's not much, but it's everything to her," Maxwell finished, remembering how their mother had done the same for neighbors in need. The tour continued, each stop revealing more about the brother he'd lost and the man he'd become. James wasn't just a doctor. He was a guardian angel to this community, fighting impossible odds to keep hope alive in a system that too often valued profit over people. But it was in the pediatric ward that Maxwell's carefully constructed walls finally began to crumble. A small boy, no more than 6, sat in a playroom constructing an elaborate tower from wooden blocks. "That's Tommy," James explained softly. "He reminds me of you, actually, always building things." Maxwell watched the child, seeing shadows of his younger self. "What's his story?" "His family lost everything in an apartment fire last month." "Sound familiar?" James's words carried no accusation, just sadness. He's recovering from smoke inhalation, but the real wounds are deeper. This place, these people, they're helping him heal in ways medicine alone can't. The revelation struck Maxwell like lightning. He hadn't just survived that long ago fire. He'd been saved by people like these, by a community that cared. And now he was about to destroy that same lifeline for thousands of others. But as they reached James's office, reality crashed back in. Maxwell's phone buzzed with messages from his board members, reminding him of the millions invested in the development project, the contracts signed, the commitments made. "It's not as simple as just stopping the demolition," Maxwell said, running a hand through his silver hair. "There are shareholders, legal obligations. There's always a reason to look the other way," James replied quietly. "That's what I told myself for years about finding you. That it was too complicated, that too much time had passed. But sometimes, Max, we have to decide what kind of person we want to be." Before Maxwell could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. A team of nurses rushed past with a crash cart, and James immediately tensed. "It's Mrs. Rodriguez," a nurse called out. "She's coding!" James sprung into action, his professional calm taking over. "Coming! Max, wait here!" Maxwell watched his brother race down the hall, the controlled urgency in his movements speaking of years of experience. But as he waited, his phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus Sterling, his head of acquisitions. "Max, we've got a problem." Sterling's voice was tense. "Someone's been digging into the hospital deal. They found irregularities in the zoning changes, suggesting preferential treatment. The press is asking questions." Maxwell's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what Sterling meant. They'd expedited the permits through channels that weren't entirely above board. Standard practice in their world, but devastating if exposed. How bad is it? Bad enough to tank the whole project if it gets out. And that's not all. The community's organizing. They're planning protests, legal challenges. If we don't move fast, this could turn ugly. As if on cue, Maxwell heard raised voices from the hospital entrance. Looking out the window, he saw a group gathering, holding signs. "Save Metropolitan General" and "People over Profit." The irony wasn't lost on him, just as he was discovering his brother and confronting his past. The very machines of power he'd built threatened to destroy everything, not just the hospital, but potentially his entire empire. If the press started digging, they might uncover other deals, other corners cut, other lives displaced in the name of progress. James returned, his scrubs showing signs of the battle just fought. His face was drawn but relieved. "We got her back. She's stable now." "How long?" Maxwell asked, his voice hoarse. "What? How long can you keep saving her? Keep saving all of them?" He gestured to the window, where the crowd was growing. "This isn't just about one building, James. It's about a whole system that's broken." James studied him carefully. "You're right, it is broken. The question is, are you going to be part of breaking it further, or are you going to help fix it?" Before Maxwell could answer, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. The headline made his heart stop. "Metropolitan General sale under investigation. Corruption allegations surface." The world he'd built so carefully was beginning to unravel, and Maxwell Rothschild found himself standing at a crossroads. On one side lay the empire he'd spent his life building, and on the other, the brother he'd just found. and the chance to become the man his mother had raised him to be. The choice he would make would change not just his life, but the lives of thousands, and time was running out. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the hospital windows as Maxwell paced James's small office, his world crumbling around him. The news about the corruption investigation had spread like wildfire, and his phone wouldn't stop buzzing with calls from board members, lawyers, and reporters. "I need to make some calls," Maxwell said, his voice tense. "Is there somewhere private I can go?" James nodded, leading him to an empty consultation room. As Maxwell reached for the door handle, his brother caught his arm. "Max, whatever you're thinking of doing, remember, there are real lives at stake here." Alone in the quiet room, Maxwell pulled out his phone and dialed Marcus Sterling's number. His head of acquisitions answered on the first ring. "It's worse than we thought," Sterling said without preamble. "Someone leaked emails about the zoning changes. They're connecting dots we spent years hiding. The board's calling for an emergency meeting." Maxwell closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decades of decisions pressing down on him. How much do they know? Enough to cause serious damage, but there's a way out. Sterling's voice dropped lower. "We've prepared a statement pinning everything on James Connor. We can say he fabricated claims about being your brother to blackmail the company. It would discredit him and the opposition to the development in one stroke." The suggestion hit Maxwell like a physical blow. "You want me to destroy my own brother?" "Brother?" Sterling scoffed. "Max, you met this man yesterday. Everything we've built, everything you've built, is at risk. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made." Before Maxwell could respond, he heard a commotion outside. Following the noise, he found himself back in the pediatric ward. Tommy, the young boy from earlier, was having a panic attack, triggered by the smell of smoke from a short-circuited coffee maker. James was already there, kneeling beside the terrified child. "It's okay, buddy, you're safe here. Remember what we practiced? Deep breaths, just like Superman." Maxwell watched as his brother calmed the boy with gentle words and steady presence, the same way their mother used to soothe them after nightmares. In that moment, he saw not just the doctor James had become, but the brother he'd lost, the one who had always protected him, even before the fire. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. The night of the fire, it wasn't just their mother who had helped save him. James, barely older but already showing the protective instincts that would define his life, had pushed him towards safety before the smoke separated them. His phone buzzed again. The board meeting would start in an hour. They expected him to throw his brother to the wolves, to sacrifice him for the sake of the company. The Maxwell Rothschild they knew would do it without hesitation. But as he watched James with Tommy, another memory emerged. This one, even more devastating. He remembered their mother's voice, her last words to them both. "Take care of each other. Promise me." A promise he'd forgotten, buried under years of ambition and greed. "Mr. Rothschild," a nurse interrupted his thoughts. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." In the lobby, he found an elderly man waiting, leaning heavily on a cane. The man's face was vaguely familiar, but Maxwell couldn't place him until he spoke. "You probably don't remember me," the man said, his voice gravelly with age. "I was the firefighter who pulled you out that night, Frank Martinez." Maxwell felt the world tilt. "You. I've been following your story in the papers all these years," Martinez continued. "Watched you become this big success, but I never told you what really happened that night." Maxwell's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" "Your mother. She didn't die in that fire, son. Not right away. She made it out, but she went back in. She went back for James." The revelation struck Maxwell like a thunderbolt. All these years, he'd believed his mother had been trapped, but she had chosen to return, to try to save his brother. She had died not as a victim, but as a hero. "She made me promise to look after you if anything happened," Martinez said, his eyes glistening. "That's why I made sure the Rothschilds took you in. They were good people, wealthy people. I thought I was giving you your best chance." Maxwell sank into a nearby chair, his carefully constructed reality shattering around him. He had built his empire on the belief that he was alone in the world, that power and money were the only things he could rely on. But he had never been alone. His mother's sacrifice, the firefighters' care, his brother's survival, all of it painted a picture of connection and responsibility he'd spent decades running from. The hospital intercom crackled to life. "Code Blue, room 415, Code Blue, room 415. James rushed past, and without thinking, Maxwell followed. They arrived at Mrs. Rodriguez's room to find her crashing again, the monitors screaming their warning. For the next 20 minutes, Maxwell watched his brother fight for her life with everything he had. The calm efficiency, the unwavering focus, the sheer determination. It was their mother's spirit living on through James. When Mrs. Rodriguez finally stabilized, James stepped out of the room, exhausted but relieved. He found Maxwell staring at his phone, at the countdown to the board meeting where he was expected to sacrifice his brother to save his empire. "I remember now," Maxwell said quietly. "That night, before the fire, Mom made us promise something." James's eyes softened. "To take care of each other. I forgot that promise, buried it so deep I couldn't feel it anymore." Maxwell's voice cracked. "But you never did you? You've been keeping it all these years, taking care of others because you couldn't take care of me." Before James could respond, Maxwell's phone lit up with another call from Sterling. The board was waiting. In 15 minutes, they would expect him to destroy his brother or watch his empire crumble. But for the first time in 40 years, Maxwell Rothschild knew exactly who he was and what he had to do. The question was whether he had the courage to do it. Looking at his brother, the living embodiment of their mother's sacrifice and love, Maxwell realized that his entire definition of success had been wrong. The true measure of a man wasn't in the empire he built, but in the promises he kept. The choice before him was clear, but the consequences would be devastating. And as he prepared to face the board, Maxwell knew that the next hour would either destroy everything he'd built or help him build something far more valuable in its place. Maxwell straightened his tie as he strode into Goldcrest Enterprises' main conference room. The board members sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces a mixture of concern and barely concealed hostility. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled beneath them, an empire of glass and steel he'd spent his life building. Marcus Sterling stood at the head of the table, projection screen ready, with what Maxwell knew would be the carefully crafted statement destroying James's credibility. The same James who was at this moment probably saving another life, keeping another promise. Maxwell, Elizabeth Chen, his longest-serving board member, spoke first. "We've prepared a statement addressing the allegations. All you need to do is sign off on it, and our legal team will handle the rest." Sterling clicked to the first slide, but Maxwell raised his hand. "Before we begin, there's something you all need to see." He pulled out his phone, bringing up the photo of his mother and two small boys. With deliberate steps, he walked around the table showing each board member the image. "This photograph was taken 40 years ago," he said, his voice steady. "The woman is my mother. The boys are me and my brother James, the same James Connor who works at Metropolitan General, the same man you're preparing to destroy." The room erupted in murmurs. Sterling's face darkened. "Max, we discussed this. Whether he's your brother or not is irrelevant. The company, Maxwell cut him off, was built on a lie. Many lies, actually, and it's time for the truth." He pressed a button on his phone, and the projection screen came to life with different images. Documents, emails, records of every shortcut they'd taken, every regulation they'd circumvented, every life they'd disrupted in their pursuit of profit. "I've just sent this entire file to the SEC and the District Attorney's office," Maxwell announced to the stunned room. "Every questionable deal, every corrupt official we bribed, every community we destroyed, including the truth about Metropolitan General." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth Chen's face had gone pale. "You'll destroy everything. The company, our reputations, your own legacy." "My legacy?" Maxwell laughed, but there was no humor in it. My legacy was built on destroying people like my mother, like my brother, people who actually make a difference in the world. I've spent 40 years becoming exactly the kind of man she died trying to protect us from. Sterling slammed his hand on the table. This is emotional nonsense. We can still contain this. The statement is a lie. Maxwell's voice cut through the room like steel. And I won't sacrifice my brother to protect an empire built on destroying lives. He turned to face the board directly. I'm calling an emergency shareholder meeting. As majority stockholder, I'm proposing an immediate restructuring. Goldcrest Enterprises will establish a community development fund, starting with Metropolitan General. We're not just going to save the hospital. We're going to rebuild it, modernize it, make it a model for ethical development. The shareholders will never approve, Sterling sputtered. The costs will be covered by selling off our luxury developments, Maxwell finished. And by liquidating my personal assets if necessary. It's time we built something worth saving. The boardroom doors burst open and security officers entered, followed by men in dark suits showing federal badges. Right on time, Maxwell said quietly. I invited them to this meeting. They'll want to speak with everyone. Especially about those zoning permits, Marcus. Sterling's face contorted with rage. You sanctimonious bastard. You're no better than any of us. You approved every deal, signed every document. You'll go down with us. Yes, Maxwell agreed calmly. I will. But for the first time in 40 years, I'll be able to look my mother in the eye when I face her again. As the federal agents began their work, Maxwell's phone buzzed with a text from James. Emergency at the hospital, need you here. He turned to leave, but Elizabeth Chen's voice stopped him. Maxwell, wait, you're really willing to lose everything? For a hospital? Maxwell looked back at the empire he'd spent his life building, at the people he'd thought were his allies, but were really just accomplices in a decades-long crime against humanity. I lost everything the night of that fire, he said softly. I just didn't know it until now. But maybe, just maybe, I can start finding it again. The drive to Metropolitan General felt different this time. Every street, every building held memories of deals made, lives changed, communities transformed, not always for the better. But as he approached the hospital, he saw something unexpected. Hundreds of people gathered outside, holding candles, their faces illuminated in the growing dusk. Inside, he found James in the pediatric ward, where Tommy sat surrounded by other children, all of them making get-well cards for Mrs. Rodriguez. The community heard about her condition, James explained. They've been bringing food, offering help. This is what we're fighting for, Max, not just a building, but a family. Maxwell watched the scene, feeling something he hadn't experienced in decades, hope. But before he could respond, his phone exploded with notifications. The news of his boardroom confession had broken. A Goldcrest CEO admits corruption, turns over evidence. Metropolitan General scandal rocks real estate empire. Maxwell Rothschild, whistleblower or conspirator. James read the headlines over his shoulder, his face growing concerned. Max, what did you do? What you've been doing all along, Maxwell replied. Keeping our promise to Mom. The sound of sirens outside grew louder, and through the windows they could see police cars arriving. Maxwell knew they were coming for him. The evidence he'd provided implicated himself as much as anyone else. They'll arrest you, James said, his voice tight with worry. Yes, Maxwell agreed, but before they do, there's something I need you to understand. He pulled out a folder he'd brought from his office. I've transferred controlling interest in Goldcrest to a trust. You're the primary trustee. James stared at him in shock. Max, I don't know anything about running a corporation. No, Maxwell smiled. But you know everything about helping people. The trust has one mandate, to transform our properties into community resources like this hospital, starting right here. The police were in the building now. They could hear footsteps approaching. Maxwell turned to his brother, seeing in him everything he could have been, should have been. I spent 40 years building an empire on the wrong foundation, he said quickly. Now it's your turn to build something better. The police appeared at the end of the hall, and Maxwell Rothschild for the first time in his adult life, felt truly free. But as they approached with handcuffs ready, a commotion from Mrs. Rodriguez's room suddenly changed everything. The monitors in Mrs. Rodriguez's room screamed their warning as medical staff rushed past Maxwell and the approaching officers. Through the doorway, he could see her body convulsing, her face turned an alarming shade of grey. James immediately sprang into action, his handcuffs forgotten as he pushed his way to her bedside. "She's throwing a pulmonary embolism," James called out, his voice sharp with urgency. "We need TPA now." Maxwell watched his brother work, remembering how their mother had moved with the same focused intensity when saving lives. The police officers, sensing the gravity of the situation, stepped back but kept their eyes fixed on him. "The medication's locked in the pharmacy," a nurse reported frantically. "The new security system." "Override it," James ordered. But the nurse shook her head. "We can't. It was part of the new cost-cutting measures. After hours, we need corporate approval for high-cost emergency medications." Maxwell felt the bitter irony wash over him. His own efficiency protocols, designed to maximize profit, were now standing between a woman and her survival. Without thinking, he pulled out his phone and dialed the emergency override code. Perhaps his last act as CEO of Goldcrest Enterprises. "Authorization granted," the system chirped, and the nurse rushed out. Mrs. Rodriguez's children burst into the room, their faces streaked with tears. The oldest, a girl no more than 16, grabbed Maxwell's arm. "Please," she begged, "save our mother." In that moment, Maxwell saw himself and James. The night of the fire, watching their own mother run back into the flames. The weight of 40 years of choices pressed down on him, but this time he knew exactly what to do. "Whatever she needs," he told James, "whatever it costs, it's covered. For her and every other patient in this hospital." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Maxwell found himself holding Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter's hand while James and his team fought to save her life. The police waited outside, professional but patient, understanding that some things transcended the law. Finally, James emerged from the room, exhausted but smiling. "She's stable. The medication worked." The relief that flooded the hallway was palpable. Mrs. Rodriguez's children hugged each other, crying tears of joy. The gathered hospital staff allowed themselves to breathe again, and Maxwell Rothschild, with federal agents on either side of him, felt a peace he hadn't known in decades. "It's time, Mr. Rothschild," one of the officers said quietly. Maxwell nodded, but James stepped forward. "Wait, there's something you need to see first." He led them to the hospital's main entrance, where the crowd had grown even larger. News of Maxwell's confession had spread, but instead of anger, the gathering had transformed into something unexpected. Patients whose lives had been saved at Metropolitan General, families who had found hope within its walls, staff members who had dedicated their lives to serving others, all stood together, holding candles in the growing darkness. Tommy, the young boy from the pediatric ward, pushed through the crowd with a handmade card. "Dr. Connor said you're his brother," he said, handing it to Maxwell, "and that you're going to save our hospital." Maxwell opened the card with trembling hands. Inside, in a child's careful writing, were the words, "Heroes come in all kinds. Thank you for being one." The federal agent cleared his throat. Cleared. "Mr. Rothschild, your cooperation and voluntary confession will be noted, but we still need to take you in." "I understand," Maxwell said, carefully putting the card in his pocket. "But there's one last thing I need to do." He turned to James, pulling out a sealed envelope. "This contains my full confession, taking responsibility for all illegal activities at Goldcrest. I've made it clear that you had no knowledge or involvement in any of it." "Max, no. Listen to me," Maxwell cut him off. "The trust I've established is clean. Every penny in it comes from legitimate sources. I've made sure of that. The hospital will be safe, but it needs you to lead it." James's eyes filled with tears. "You can't just sacrifice yourself like this." "Can't I?" Maxwell smiled sadly. "Mom did. She ran back into that fire knowing she might not make it out, because saving others mattered more than saving herself. You've spent your whole life living that same truth. It's time I did the same. He turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice carrying across the hushed space. Metropolitan General isn't just a hospital. It's a promise that every life has value, that every person deserves care and dignity. I forgot that promise once, but thanks to my brother, I've remembered it. And I swear to you, whether I'm free or behind bars, this hospital will not only survive, but thrive. A cheer went up from the crowd, and Maxwell felt something break inside him. Not the shattering of his old life, but the breaking of a new dawn. He turned back to the federal agents, holding out his wrists, but before they could move, an elderly voice called out from the crowd, "Wait!" Frank Martinez, the firefighter who had saved him so long ago, made his way forward. "There's something else you all need to know about Maxwell Rothschild." Over the next half hour, Martinez revealed details about Maxwell's past that even he hadn't known. How the young Maxwell, after being adopted by the Rothschilds, had anonymously funded scholarships for children who'd lost parents in fires. How he'd secretly contributed to firefighters' benevolent funds across the city. Small acts of kindness that had been buried beneath years of corporate ambition, but had never completely died. "The boy I pulled from that fire never really forgot his roots," Martinez concluded. "He just lost his way for a while, but now he's found it again." The federal agents conferred quietly, then approached Maxwell. "Given your cooperation and these new revelations, we're prepared to recommend house arrest pending trial, provided you continue to assist with the investigation and support the hospital's transition." Relief washed over James's face, but Maxwell remained serious. "On one condition," he said. "I want to work here, at the hospital, not as an executive, but as a volunteer. I have 40 years of penance to perform." The agents agreed. And as the crowd cheered again, Maxwell turned to his brother. "I can't undo the past," he said softly, "but maybe I can help build a better future." James pulled him into a tight embrace. "Mom would be proud," he whispered, "of both of us." Over the next year, Metropolitan General underwent a transformation. The Trust, under James's guidance, not only modernized the hospital, but established programs to serve the community's most vulnerable members. Maxwell, wearing an ankle monitor and working alongside the cleaning staff, learned every patient's name, every family's story. He found that the real measure of a man wasn't in the height of his towers, but in the depth of his compassion. Mrs. Rodriguez made a full recovery and often brought homemade meals to the hospital staff. Tommy, finally released from the pediatric ward, returned regularly to show Dr. Connor his latest building block creations. And the brothers, separated for 40 years by fire and fate, worked side by side to keep their mother's legacy alive. One evening, as sunset painted the hospital walls with golden light, Maxwell found James in their mother's old ward, now renovated and renamed in her honor. "Do you think she knew?" Maxwell asked quietly. "That night, when she ran back in, do you think she knew we'd find each other again?" James smiled, tears in his eyes. "She knew love always finds its way home, Max, even if it takes 40 years to get there." Outside the window, the city skyline still bore Maxwell Rothschild's mark. But now, among the towers of glass and steel, Metropolitan General stood as a beacon of hope, a testament to the truth that it's never too late to remember who you really are and what really matters. And in the heart of that beacon, two brothers kept their promise to a mother who had taught them that the greatest success isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in lives touched and hearts healed. For in the end, that was the only legacy worth building. Your opinion matters. What would you do if you discovered that someone from your past has the power to completely change your present? Do you think money and success can truly fill the void left by the absence of family? Don't keep your thoughts to yourself. Share them in the comments. Your perspective might help others reflect on their own decisions and values. If this story touched your heart, help us spread its message to others. Give it a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss out on stories that will make you believe in the power of redemption and true love. And if this story moved you, don't miss the one appearing on the left side of your screen. I promise it will take you on the same emotional roller coaster with twists you won't see coming and an ending that will leave you breathless. Hit play. You won't regret it. See you in the next story.